Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with our daily update for December 2nd, 2021. I'm going to continue on the theme I've been covering most of this week, which is on the question of, are the transatlantic war hawks crazy enough to provoke a war with Russia? The NATO Foreign Ministers just held a meeting in Riga, Latvia the last couple of days, and they were intensely focused on this question of the so-called Russian massing of troops on the border with Ukraine. At the meeting, the U.S. and others presented so-called evidence, which was mostly fabricated by the West, that drew the conclusion that the Russians are preparing to invade Ukraine. Stoltenberg, the NATO General Secretary, had this to say. He said, any future Russian aggression against Ukraine would come at a high price and have serious political and economic consequences for Russia. He stressed that NATO is threatening such consequences to ensure that Russia does not underestimate NATO's resolve. Now, Anton Blinken, the Secretary of State, who's a very well-known Russophobe, said the following, quote, "We don't know whether President Putin has made the decision to invade. We do know that he is putting in place the capacity to do so, should he so decide," unquote. And then he went on to say, completely hypocritically, that the U.S. is urging Ukraine to exercise restraint so that Russia can't proclaim they were provoked. Now, it's actually NATO and the U.S. that are behind the provocations. Go back to the coup in February 2014. That was manufactured by the U.S. and NATO, with Joe Biden at the time the point man for the Obama administration. The U.S. refuses to put pressure on the government in Kiev to follow through on the commitments made in negotiations at the Normandy Four and the Minsk meetings, which would have allowed some autonomy for eastern Ukraine. Instead, they're continuing to drop shells and drones into eastern Ukraine, and then accuse the Russians of having secret armies hidden out in the woods of eastern Ukraine. They're providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. They're engaging in maneuvers in the Black Sea, which encroached on Russian territorial waters. Flights of nuclear-capable bombers to within 15 miles of the Russian border. Now, don't forget that the Russians are fully aware of the U.S. role in regime change wars all around the world, in North Africa, in South Asia, and Central Asia, and the buildup going on specifically around the Baltic states and Ukraine, but also in the South China Sea. And that the U.S. is that the U.S. policy included arming and training Islamic terrorists in Iraq and Syria. Now, Putin addressed this issue on December 1st, raising the issue of military exercises along the border. He said Russia had to develop hypersonic weapons in response to NATO's eastward expansion. And he said this eastward expansion has occurred despite pledges made repeatedly in 1990 and afterwards that there would be no eastward expansion. Instead, what have we been doing? The West has put anti-ballistic missile systems in Poland and Romania. These include the capability to deploy offensive Tomahawk strike systems, which could easily reach far inside Russia. Now, in the meantime, the Russian threat is being used for what? To consolidate NATO uniformity, to promote Western disinformation, which is used to increase defense spending, as well as to mobilize NATO. And what's the effect of this? Well, one effect is it convinces Ukrainian war hawks that they can move against Russia in expectation that if Russia does something in reaction, that NATO will intervene to defend them. So this is where you see the buildup of a provocation toward war. Along with this, NATO expelled Russian diplomats in Russia's NATO mission. and has cut off discussion repeatedly about objections raised by Russia about the arms going to Ukraine, about the military maneuvers, and so on. Now, in the midst of this, we begin to get a better picture of who's behind this escalation. Richard Moore, who's the current head of MI6, he came in October 2020. He gave his first public address a couple of days ago. And what he said is that the greatest threat to the West is coming from China, Russia, Iran, and terrorism. And he said China is the greatest threat. But he said, don't underestimate Russia. Russia is still an acute threat. And he said, quote, we must stand up and deter Russian activity, which contravenes the international rules-based system. There's the key phrase again, rules-based system, rules-based order. Now, you have to ask yourself, does the rules-based system allow lying for the sake of launching military action, to justify missions such as the destruction of Iraq based on the lie which came directly from MI6 of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction? What about the British lie that the Russians were paying bounties to the Taliban to kill Americans in Afghanistan, which U.S. intelligence, even the corrupt networks in U.S. intelligence, refused to go along with? What about the lies about chemical weapons attacks in Syria? Is that part of the rules-based system? You know, the hypocrisy serves a purpose to build up this narrative that Russia and China are enemies of the West. They're authoritarian systems. They cannot be trusted. And we have to be prepared to fight them. Now, how are you going to fight them? With nuclear weapons? Because ultimately, if something is provoked in Ukraine, what would stop Russia, if they intended to do so, from overrunning Ukraine in a very short period of time? Is the U.S. willing to risk nuclear war to defend a corrupt regime of oligarchs in Ukraine, which depends on Nazi militia units for their defense? Is that what we're prepared to do? Is that the rules-based system? Now, we're going to keep speaking about this because these issues have to be heard in the United States. Our voice will be heard. Where are the other voices of sanity? It used to be that you had factions in the Congress in both parties that spoke up against war. There are still people doing so. And we'll have some interviews up on our website shortly, including with Chaz Freeman, a very high-level former State Department official who discusses these kinds of questions. But for the most part, there's a unanimity from the West of at least silence, but more importantly, provocative language. Now, in addressing this, Putin issued a call for a written agreement that there will be no further NATO eastward expansion, that Ukraine and Georgia will not become members of NATO. And he referred back to the agreements that were made in 1990 that there would be no eastward expansion. I've spoken to a German eyewitness who was in on some of these meetings because they were centered around the issue of German reunification. And the pledge was made to Gorbachev, specifically by James Baker, the Secretary of State, in February 1990. As Baker put it, there would be not 1 inch of eastward expansion of NATO. Not 1 inch. In the meantime, NATO has incorporated the Baltic states. It's moving into Poland. You have throughout Eastern Europe the deployment of NATO forces. And Stoltenberg is talking about possibly placing nuclear weapons in these countries. So was there an agreement? Well, James Baker said so. Aides to Helmut Kohl said so. Even aides to Margaret Thatcher said so. However, in May of this year, Chatham House, which is the center of British intelligence, put out a report saying that, quote, it's a myth that Russia was promised that NATO would not enlarge, unquote. So this is how they're attempting to make future history, by lying about the past, lying about the present, lying about their intentions, and imposing on our so-called enemies the intentions that exist within Chatham House, within the City of London, and within our military defense establishment. That's why we have to keep speaking about this. This is a security threat that can only be addressed by actually achieving agreements on mutual benefit, which include stabilizing Afghanistan, which include reconstructing the nations of the Middle East that have been victims of the endless wars. And it includes not provoking crazies in Ukraine with the argument that we know the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. There was a famous movie in the 1960s in the United States that made fun of that, called The Russians Are Coming, the Russians Are Coming. That was meant as a farce. Unfortunately, with Blinken's rules-based order, they're deadly serious about it, and we have to stop it before this deadly serious threat is fulfilled. So thanks for joining me today. Tomorrow is Friday, so I'll take your questions. You can send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com.